The eastern United States have seen its fair share of serial killers in the past. John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis Rader, just to name a few. They all have one very important thing in common. They were all caught. But between the 1990s and 2020s, a rash of deaths would convince some that there might have been one or more killers still on the loose. Today we ask ourselves, who are the Smiley Face Killers? Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. As always, I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. In this episode, we are delving into the dark world of true crime, rather than the normal cases of the paranormal and cryptozoology. In this episode, we are looking into multiple mysterious cases of young men suddenly going missing in the eastern United States, only to be found dead weeks later. Since the 1990s, the bodies of otherwise fit and healthy young men have been fished out of local waterways in cities across multiple states, only to be deemed an accident by the authorities despite the bodies being found in places already searched by the police. As far as the local officers who investigated these cases were concerned, these deaths were completely accidental and not worth the time and resources it would take to open up an investigation when everyone involved agreed it only seemed like an unfortunate accident. But although the police and investigators deemed them to be accidents, there have been a few who believe there are connections to each death, pointing to a possible theory that the bodies of those men fished out of the canals and rivers were actually kidnapped, murdered, then dumped at the scene where police had already searched beforehand. This theory is born out of the determined mind of three men, two retired New York City detectives, Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, and criminal justice professor and gang expert at St. Cloud State University, Dr. Lee Gilbertson. What they would go on to call an epidemic have seemed to have been taking place for the past several decades. It always seems to happen the same way. A young white male with a promising scholastic career and are very well-educated students are usually out for a night on the town with a bunch of their friends, and usually they've had a little bit to drink. Some not too much, others were reportedly quite generous with the glass, but all seem to disappear in the same way. After leaving the bar or wherever they were with their friends, the victim would then wander off down a secluded route to head home, only to go missing at some point on their walk, with no traces or clues on where they had gone or ended up. Although some like to say this theory is just grasping at straws that aren't actually there, Gannon, Duarte, and Gilbertson's theory of a single serial killer or multiple serial killers have gained more and more support over the years for those who, too, are left wondering why some things just didn't add up in the initial police investigations. Now, the reasoning for being called the Smiley Face murders or killings, which this theory is appropriately named after, is because even after the eerily similar circumstances of these men going missing and winding up dead, people and police have reported finding crudely drawn or painted smiley faces somewhere nearby where the body was found or would be later found. These next few stories, which have been shared and discussed over the course of the past few years, have many coincidences and similarities that have led people to believe the Smiley Face Killers are real and are out there. On a cold February night in 1997, 21-year-old Fordham University student Patrick McNeil was out celebrating with friends at bars dotting New York's Upper East Side. He and his friends had been bar hopping all night and ended up at a bar known as the Dapper Dog shortly before midnight, when Patrick looked at his friends and told them he was tired and decided to turn in early. He had some early classes in the morning and decided to leave and walk to the subway where he would get a ride back to the university. One of his friends stated she too was feeling tired and was going to head back with Patrick right after using the ladies' room and told Patrick to wait for her. But when she exited the restroom, Patrick was already gone. His other friends reported he was incredibly drunk and stumbling out of the bar, where they presumed he would simply just be waiting for his friend to join him on their short walk to the subway. but as they watched him leave, none of them had any idea it would be the last time any of them would ever see him alive again. Patrick didn't show up to his class in the morning, which might not have been strange after a night of heavy drinking. It's not uncommon for a university student to miss out on an early morning class, but as the days went by with no word from him and nobody seeing him, people began to worry. It wasn't until 10 days later on the 26th of February did a massive search effort begin to take place. Along with the police, 600 volunteers showed up in hopes of helping find the lost young man. Over 10,000 flyers were printed out and distributed around the city, with detectives from both Westchester and New York City scouring soup kitchens, hospitals, and the area where he had last been seen, and even Rikers Island. Sadly though, all of their efforts were in vain and no sign or clue on where Patrick McNeil went came forth. People who had seen Patrick walking through the streets on the night he went missing mentioned he had looked worried and maybe a little nervous, but of course most people probably just chalked that up to his inebriated state he was in. Though there were some who did tell of something suspicious at the time. There had been a few who came forward at the time saying they also noticed a vehicle that seemed to be slowly following him with each turn. Once this was brought to light, investigators became suspicious and concerned that perhaps they were dealing with a possible kidnapping, but with little to no evidence of that being the case, they were hesitant to say that this was the prevailing theory. It wasn't until April 7th, just a week under 2 months since Patrick's disappearance, did somebody find his body downriver floating near a pier in the East River near Brooklyn, just over 12 miles from where he was last seen. It was clear from the state of the decomposing body by the on-scene investigators they may possibly be dealing with less of an accidental death like they had initially thought, and more so dealing with a possible kidnapping and homicide. To which then they transferred the case from the Missing Persons Department and reassigned it to the NYPD's homicide detective, Kevin Gannon. During the examination of the corpse, more aspects about the body's condition convinced Gannon more and more that Patrick was the victim of something sinister. Skin slippage occurs roughly 6 to 10 days after death. When this happens, the skin begins to slowly peel off the body after being in the elements for so long. But there was a surprising lack of slippage on the skin of Patrick's body, pointing Gannon to the idea that Patrick was held hostage for nearly 2 months and then only recently was killed and dumped in the water. If he had died the night when he went missing, the skin slippage should have been incredibly prevalent on his body after 2 months of drifting in the waters. Next, for some reason half of his clothes were missing, and he was face up in the water. If this was an accidental drowning, most victims of it aren't typically face up in the water when it happens. There's also the discoloration in the face and front of the corpse, clearly indicating Patrick had died face down, allowing the blood to settle at the front of the body. But if this were the case, why was it that he was found faced up? Another telling sign of foul play was involved was the signs of rope or wire markings and burns around the neck and wrists. With all of this adding up, it was enough for Gannon to assign those who had been trailing Patrick in the vehicle on the night of his disappearance as strong persons of interest. There's something also to be said that Patrick was an ex-high school football captain, a large athletic male who shouldn't have been as drunk as he seemed to be on that fateful night. Apparently, he had only had a few drinks, not nearly enough to put a man that size and shape to be stumbling around nearly passing out. Gannon theorized perhaps one of his drinks at some point in the night was possibly spiked with Rohypnol or something of the like. If it was colorless, tasteless, and Patrick wasn't paying attention to his drink 100% of the time he was consuming it at the bar, perhaps someone had slipped something into one of his few drinks he had, which caused him to become incredibly inebriated. The symptoms of Rohypnol are similar to that of being drunk: impaired speech, muscle coordination, blackouts, and being virtually untraceable in an autopsy, which would explain why the blood alcohol level in Patrick's body was so low, but also no trace of drugs were found. But despite all of his theories and what seemed to be promising evidence of foul play, the chief medical examiner still determined it to be an accidental drowning. Rather than open up a possible homicide case, most officials were content with believing Patrick McNeil had just gotten a little too drunk, left the bar on his own accord, and clumsily wandered towards the subway where he possibly made a stop to relieve himself at the nearby waterway. Then, because of his lack of balance due to his state, he fell into the water and accidentally drowned in his panic. To most, the case was shut and dry, a simple accident that was incredibly unlucky and unfortunate. Though to Gannon, he firmly believed it was no accident and was the work of a possible killer or killers. In the years to follow, his hypothesis would seem true, as he would be faced with more similar cases, pointing to the presence of a new and active serial killer. It wouldn't be until a few years later would more and more cases be brought to light with strangely similar deaths. Back when everyone was celebrating the passing of Y2K, Brian Welzen and friends were out taking part in the festivities, hopping from one bar to the next. It was nearing the end of their night when the 21-year-old finance student quickly became violently ill and began vomiting multiple times in public despite only having a couple drinks. This promptly put an end to Brian's night, and he got a ride back to his hotel by some friends, where he was dropped off but was said to be still extremely sick. It was when he was dropped off at his hotel was the last time any of his friends would ever see him again. It took the police 77 days to find the body of Brian Welzen, washed ashore on a beach in Gary, Indiana, roughly 30 miles south of Chicago. Again, the investigators involved with finding a conclusion to Brian's case determined it to be an accidental drowning, thinking perhaps Brian had gone out for a walk for some fresh air and somehow fell into Lake Michigan, which was just a 5-minute walk from his hotel. What was most strange about Brian's case was the blood alcohol level found in the autopsy. Toxicologist Dr. Frank Pollock was asked by Gannon and Gilbertson to re-examine Brian's toxology report under suspicion he might have been drugged during his celebration out at the bars. Dr. Pollock had to say this after the re-examination. So we have a blood alcohol level found during the autopsy of 0.084. Based on the reports that I had, the story was that Brian had had about 2 drinks, and that's just inadequate. So there was something horribly wrong with how sick he was appearing to be, and how passed out he was. Now, 0.084 blood alcohol level is not necessarily high to the point where he should have been vomiting after 2 drinks. While it is over the legal limit to drive, it's barely over, and shouldn't have caused him to become that violently ill. Again, we're talking about a 21-year-old university student who's also fairly physically fit. He honestly should have had a higher tolerance to alcohol, and that little amount shouldn't have caused him to fall into Lake Michigan and drown. But of course, this is just speculation on my part, and there's a lot of variables which may have caused him to become intoxicated easier. Lack of food and water the day before and during the day. Perhaps he was already feeling sick at the time, or he had just consumed other drinks at some point in the night without his friends noticing. But looking at it like Gannon, Gilbertson, and Duarte has, it could have been very easy for someone at the bar to slip an untraceable drug into his drink while he wasn't looking, which caused Brian's apparent sudden illness. Then there's also the strange fact that he had been missing for 77 days before his body was even found. But I will admit there could be a reason for this too. If Brian had fallen into Lake Michigan while drunk, he could have been swept out into the lake by a current, which is quite frequent in Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan, in fact, has a reputation for being the deadliest of all the Great Lakes, where many deaths and rescues occur annually. Just in 2020, for an example, there had been 53 reported deaths that had taken place in the lake. Now, if we take into account that Brian was sick, possibly drunk, a strong current might have taken him out, and the fact that it was January, when the lake is at its coldest, especially at night, and has ice forming in it. All of this could have contributed to Brian accidentally drowning, although we can't dismiss how this case was so similar to Patrick McNeil's just 3 years earlier in New York. Let's now fast forward to 2005 and investigate the next possible killing. It's here Gannon, Duarte, and Gilbertson get their first indication that these past killings are more than likely connected, and the first appearance of the famous smiley faces used to taunt the detectives and investigators. This next possible victim went by the name of Todd Gieb, a 22-year-old student who had been out attending a bonfire party with friends on the 2nd of July. Now it's the same scenario as the previous two. He was out partying with friends, he's had a couple drinks but not too much, and then suddenly disappearing with nobody knowing where he had gone. Todd wasn't found until 21 days later, floating upright in a private lake in Muskegon, Michigan. Again, it was ruled as an accidental drowning by the police, believing he had just been too intoxicated and wandered into the lake where he eventually drowned. Todd's mother, however, Kathy Gieb, wasn't in agreement after seeing the photographs of her son's body. After hearing her son had drowned, she began doing her own research on the after effects of drowning victims. Then, after being shown the photograph of her son, she realized something was off. The autopsy report also aligned with her theory that her son had not been in the water for the past 3 weeks like the police had initially claimed. There were only small signs of decomposition, and his clothing and hair was relatively clean from any algae biofilm, which is the thin layer of bacteria that can be found on the surface of most bodies of water. In the police reports, there were also no mention of insects swarming or laying eggs on the body. If a body was sitting in water for 3 weeks, it would have decomposed enough for flies, larvae, or other bugs to make the ears, mouth, and clothing on the body their home. Insects are extremely attracted to corpses of both humans and wild animals within hours after death. Surely after 3 weeks of being in a lake, there would have been much more than what was found. It's also worth to mention again the unusual position Todd's body was found in. He was vertically floating in the lake with just his head and arm above the surface. A very unlikely position for someone to drown in. But it's here we find our first actual clue that something else might be going on behind the drownings. When retrieving Todd's body from the lake, it was reported that a smiley face had been spray painted on one of the trees nearby. Now one can only assume if this was coincidence and how long it had been there for. In the end, it could mean nothing. But it was shortly after Todd was put to rest. A small sticker would be found placed on his gravestone. It was a small, yellow and black, smiley face. A little over a year later, on October 2nd of 2006, after a day of celebrating Oktoberfest, university student Lucas Homan went missing from downtown La Crosse in Wisconsin. This time, however, it was only 3 days before his body would turn up floating down the Mississippi River. A little different time frame from the previous victims, with it only being 3 days, but same sort of scenario. We have an athletic young man who hadn't consumed too much alcohol to inhibit his swimming ability by any means, and his friends he had been with said he had been completely fine before going missing. They also mentioned that they, including Lucas, had no reason to be near the water during the night he had gone missing. The fact that he ended up there for no reason was a big part of the mystery, concerning the warnings Lucas's parents had given him before leaving off to university, to stay away from the water after a rash of drownings in the area had been in the news recently. But despite this, not only was his body found lifeless in the water, but a smiley face spray painted on a nearby building was reportedly spotted. 2 years after Lucas had gone missing and found dead, Tommy Booth, a 24-year-old student, had gone missing outside a Pennsylvania bar after celebrating a friend's birthday. His disappearance took place early January, with his body not being found until 2 weeks later on the 19th. Again, it's the same scenario. Didn't have too much to drink, wandered outside by himself, and was never seen alive again. The police, of course, deemed it as another accidental drowning, and the case was seemingly shut for them. However, a small, almost unnoticeable clue was found at the scene where Tommy was last seen from. Just behind the building where Tommy had been drinking that fateful night was a small, crudely spray-painted smiley face. Despite the police closing the case and deeming it as another accidental death, there were some clues that someone else had been at the scene where Tommy's body was eventually found. In the sand and mud leading up to Tommy's body, there were obvious signs of drag marks, as if someone had been dragging Tommy by his 2 legs. There was also another set of footprints found walking around the body. With these being right at the edge of the water, if they had been there for a while, they more than likely would have been washed away. This would mean Tommy would have had to have been murdered and then brought there very recently before being found. With more evidence of the body lacking 2 weeks worth of decomposition from being in the water, the idea that Tommy was held captive for 2 weeks, then killed and dumped by the water's edge, and with a smiley face being found at the bar where he had disappeared from, all suggest that the theory of a possible killer is more than likely. The next year, in 2009, William Hurley, a 24-year-old Navy veteran, would become the next victim of this string of similar deaths. He had been out attending a Boston Bruins hockey game with some friends before calling his fiancée Claire LeBeau, asking her to come to the stadium to pick him up halfway through the game. According to William, he wasn't feeling very good and was tired and just wanted to come home. As Claire drove to the stadium, she called him to find out exactly where he was waiting for her, to which he asked a passerby who said 99 Nashua Street. William warned Claire that he would stay put because his battery on his phone was running very low, but when she arrived at the location, William was gone. She attempted to call again, but this time it would seem she couldn't get a hold of him, most likely because his phone had died by this point. She circled around the block, then parked and walked around to go looking, but she still couldn't find any sign of him. In the search that eventually ensued for him, only his cell phone was found on 99 Nashua Street, and it had been very badly damaged. It wouldn't be until 6 days later William would be found, face down in the Charles River. It's with this case that the obvious signs of malicious action would be evident. Unlike the past cases, small injuries or markings could be easily explained by something else, but with William's case it's a little different. Not only was his phone found completely damaged by something purposely crushing it, and I'm not talking about a tire of a vehicle because while a vehicle tire can crack and squish the phone, William's phone was thoroughly broken apart, as if someone had taken a hammer to it multiple times. Then, when looking over his body after being found, it was clear he had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of his head, as if someone had clubbed him in order to knock him out. Not only this, but there was also trauma to one of his eye sockets and on his left leg. With his body being found reasonably soon after his death and disappearance, unlike the others in the past, the autopsy showed that William did have GHB in his system, which is known as a date rape drug. Now, there should have been absolutely no reason why that had been in his system at the time. He had been drinking at a hockey game with friends, but not heavily, so chances are at some point during the game someone had to have spiked his drink, causing him to feel sick and leave early without his friends in an attempt to get him outside alone. And again, of course, a smiley face had been found near the river where William's body had been retrieved. Dakota James is the final victim I'll mention here on this episode. He was a 23-year-old graduate student who was found floating in the Ohio River back in 2017. Last seen alive on a surveillance camera in the Cultural District of Pittsburgh and turning down an alleyway, he had previously been out drinking with friends at some local pubs and left alone to head home. It was believed by police he had crossed the Clement Bridge and walked down some steps toward the river below to urinate, where, in his inebriated state, probably had fallen in and drowned. It was believed because it was the middle of January, the freezing water of the river and the alcohol in his system caused him to lose feeling in his arms and legs, which ultimately caused his drowning. But his parents suspected something else was at play here when they got the call that he was missing. They temporarily moved to Pittsburgh to help with the search and to plead with authorities to begin an official search. It took nearly an entire week of Dakota being missing did the police finally file a missing persons report and begin their search. It was then during their search for their son, Dakota's parents received some unsettling news. According to one of Dakota's friends, something like this had happened before. Dakota didn't want to worry them at the time, but during the search, one of his friends told his parents about 6 weeks earlier, Dakota had possibly been drugged at a bar and that someone had tried to abduct him, but didn't succeed. For 40 days, Dakota would go unfound, until eventually his body appeared just 10 miles down the Ohio River from where he was suspected to have fallen in. Now again, things didn't add up here. The decomposition of the body was very inconsistent with what someone who had spent over a month in the water would be. Internally and externally, the body seemed like it had only been in the water for maybe a couple days. The body itself was in such good condition, there were no scratch marks or bruising found on it, which might seem like a good sign that foul play wasn't involved, but there's one thing wrong with this. From the point where he had supposedly fallen into the river and where he was found, there's a dam. For the body to have passed through the rushing and violent waters created by the dam, then go through the concrete and metal makeup of the dam itself, only to come out completely unscathed is near impossible. Then, further points have been made about the autopsy after it was done and some of the pictures that was taken during it. Around Dakota's neck there had been clear evidence of a type of ligature that was around it but also for some reason left out of the police report. There were no signs of internal damage to the neck, so he wasn't strangled to death, but there had been something wrapped around it. There was also blood pooled in his fingers on both hands, indicating he may have been trying very hard to pull off whatever was around his neck. When asked about why the ligatures weren't shown on the police report, but were very clearly shown on one of the pictures of the autopsy, the DA says it was simply just dried blood that had pooled onto the neck out of Dakota's nose and mouth. Now this didn't seem right to everyone, so upon providing a second picture of the requested photo to confirm and try to get a better view of it, Gannon noticed the neck was now thoroughly cleaned with no signs of any markings. This then set off the investigators and the family, making the very fair and accusatory point that if Dakota had actually spent 40 days in the river, why didn't those markings come off? Then, when the medical examiners were questioned about them, the next day those markings were all of a sudden gone. This then made the family and investigators all skeptical on the police and medical examiners' role in what was going on here. With the mounting pressure from the family and investigators and the sheer number of obvious signs of foul play involved, the case of Dakota James had been changed from a case of accidental drowning to a case of homicide, but is not being treated as a case of criminal homicide, meaning there is no further investigating being done unless new evidence comes forward. And of course, I'm not forgetting this. If you're wondering, yes, there was another smiley face found spray painted on an underpass near where Dakota's body was found. adding weight to the theory that the Smiley Face Killers are still out there. For over the past quarter of a century, Gannon and his team had discovered cases of over 50 young men all dying in a similar manner, but ultimately most being ruled as simple accidental drownings across the eastern United States. Some of these we could safely assume were in fact just accidents of young men drowning under what some would call strange circumstances, but it's not impossible in some of these cases. What many do agree on though, with the sheer number of similar cases there have been, and with so many questions unanswered with each one of them, there is a very good chance that there is a or are killers who identify themselves as the Smiley Face Killers. The fact that most of these cases involve the kidnapping, holding, and then killing of healthy, fit young men is all the more convincing. Most serial killers typically like to pick out prey who are easy targets, so going after relatively fit and healthy young men is very different. With these similar occurrences happening in several different states throughout the past 30 years, has not only Gannon, Duarte, and Gilbertson believing there is a connected gang of killers operating in the eastern United States, but with pieces being connected seemingly every few years, more and more people are believing they are right. With what seems to be very strong resistance from many police departments and agencies, however, Gannon and his colleagues have found tracking down important evidence that could link many of the crimes together to be increasingly difficult. But I don't necessarily blame the police for withholding evidence from active investigations or non-active ones too. Gannon and Duarte are retired, and Gilbertson is a professor. All of them are considered to be regular citizens now and don't have authority to access such records. So I understand why the police are not fully cooperative with them with releasing sensitive information or evidence. There are also those in public who wonder how much damage these types of investigations are possibly causing the families and friends who've mourned the loss of their loved ones and are trying to move on. To some, the constant hope promised by Gannon and his team that they will find answers and justice for their loved ones, only to learn nothing new for years, it must be very demoralizing. Then there's also the argument that Gannon and his team are promoting the Smiley Face Killers, as it were, by giving them attention and a platform for these killings to become viral. Others have criticized the investigators to cherry-picking facts and only focusing on certain aspects of these cases that support their theory of a serial killer or killers, while in reality there's just as much evidence to support that a lot of the cases were in fact accidental. The main one being the smiley faces, for an example. People have been innocently drawing and painting smiley faces on buildings for decades, as it's one of the most popular signs in graffiti. The fact these bodies happen to wind up near one could simply all just be a coincidence. Or, unbeknownst to a graffiti artist, they draw the face without even knowing a body had been found near the area, then inadvertently causing people to believe the Smiley Face Killers had been in the area, were responsible for the recent death, and had struck again. Then there's also the idea that because the Smiley Face Killer theory has become so popular recently, there have simply been people going out and painting these faces in poor taste to further propagate the narrative. But even with all this, there still seems to be enough concerning evidence out there suggesting someone is out there kidnapping, murdering, and then dumping the bodies of young men. I, for one, am a firm believer it is likely that one or more people are responsible for these seemingly random deaths. People have suggested it might be a cult behind these killings, others say it could possibly be gang activities, but with most of these cases involving the victims seemingly being drugged, held captive for several weeks, then turn up dead in nearby waterways with signs of restraints being used on them, suggests to me it's a methodical individual or a methodical group of killers who have yet to be even close to being identified. We can only hope these rash of killings or accidental deaths run their course and their end is on the horizon, for the sake of not only the family members left wondering what really happened, but for those possible victims yet to be targeted. This not only goes for those living in the eastern United States, but for everyone everywhere. Keep an eye on your drinks while out at the bars, stick with your friends, and be sure you have a safe way home, because you never know who might be watching and waiting. I hope you enjoyed this break from the paranormal and supernatural for a bit of true crime this time, but don't worry, I'll be getting back into the paranormal stuff again. However, my full-time job is going to be getting a bit busy for a while, so I may be late on the next couple episodes and getting them out on time. But I will try my best to stay on the bi-weekly schedule. I'm just letting you guys all know right now, there could be times where I miss a day or two getting the episode done. But in the meantime, if you had any suggestions for an episode, or had a story of your own you wanted to share, or if you simply just wanted to message me and say hi, feel free to do so by email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com. or on Instagram at Moonlight Lore Podcast, where you can also follow me to see some of the photos of some topics I talk about on here. If you have a moment, consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. It only takes a minute and helps the podcast a ton. And if you have family or friends you think might also be interested in the topics I talk about on here, send them on over. I hope you guys enjoyed this walk down true crime lane, and I definitely have plans to do more in the future. But until that happens, keep your lanterns lit, keep your drinks covered, and keep exploring the unknown.